Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 5 lecture for Early American Literature. Today, I want to discuss the John Winthrop text, A Model of Christian Charity. And as a way of just entering into a conversation about this text, I would want to bring to your attention this movement we've made over the last couple of weeks and how this movement fits within perhaps the larger trajectory of the ideas and the texts that we've considered. Because something you may have noticed early in the semester, we read and considered texts that described these first encounters between Native Americans and European settlers. And we talked about how Native Americans were described and characterized. We talked about some of the oversimplified mischaracterizations. But over the last couple of weeks, we have progressively moved away from that portion of the class, and we've moved into this space where what we're actually thinking about, or what the texts that I've asked you to read want you to think about, are, well, how did these early European settlers think about what these communities should look like? What should the composition of these communities look like? What sorts of ideas and laws and values defined these early European settler communities? And perhaps more importantly, and something I'll return to, were these ideas, were these laws, were these notions just simply too idealistic? Is it even possible to do and to have what Bradford argues for and argues about, especially when thinking about notions of prosperity? I believe I addressed that last week. And when thinking about Winthrop today, again, is any of this viable at all? And just on the whole, what do you make of how utopian and how idealistic all of this sounds? Now, the text itself is quite interesting because even though it looks like an essay, it's actually I'll say, transcript of a sermon that Winthrop delivered in 1630, but the actual text itself was composed after he delivered the sermon. So again, scholars seem to think perhaps a model of Christian charity as we have it as a text is potentially incomplete. Again, there's some uncertainty about the veracity of the text itself, maybe because it was composed after. There's some massaging of what Winthrop said, perhaps some inserting of certain overt ideological notions and injunctions. But again, like so much of what we've read this semester, a model of Christian charity is cloaked in uncertainty and even notions of incompleteness. Now, the actual text itself, and I always like to mention this, that I do think it is quite nice and quite refreshing to realize that something like a sermon, that students in a class like this could place such a text under the same kind of scrutiny they would place a novel or a short story or a poem. Again, just the text itself, the simple fact that it's a sermon, really reveals something interesting about the literature produced during this period, again, the mid-17th century. But the format itself, this question and answer format, it's something that these Puritans would have known. It would have felt native to them. They would have understood this format, even if it might seem to us today a bit odd and a bit atypical. It certainly would not have for a Puritan in 1630, for example. So on page 178, Winthrop begins with this notion of destiny, which, again, it might create this conceptual chain linking Rawlinson and Bradford and Winthrop together, and I'll talk more about this as we enter into the text, but this notion of destiny seems extremely important to Winthrop because, again, it seems to suggest there's something preordained about what they're doing, and that's important for someone like Winthrop. But some of the other ideas that I want to think about just quickly, again, Winthrop wants to describe the parameters of a harmonious Christian community. I've mentioned that already. He seems to insist that the world is watching them. This is something that perhaps even Bradford alluded to in previous readings. And this has the effect of rendering the success or the failure of this project in more important and consequential terms. And because this is such an idealistic text, it is worth considering the degree to which Winthrop's project was potentially destined to fail, as all heavily idealistic and utopian projects are or seem to be. And finally, I'll say a fair amount about this city upon a hill metaphor and how it informs notions of American exceptionalism. So I think I'll just start here on page 178 with that short section that reads a model hereof. And this is what Winthrop writes. God Almighty, in his most holy and wise providence, hath so disposed of the condition of mankind, as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. So once again, this language should create a kind of chain linking Rawlinson and Bradford, because all of this seems to imply that so much of this is preordained, that there's perhaps very little that any particular individual can do, if anything at all, to change or shift their lot in life, because all of this was part of this larger plan, this larger schematic, perhaps. And what Winthrop seems to introduce here, again, is something that sounds quite similar to what we saw in Rawlinson. If you accept this premise that God has preordained everything to exist in these particular ways, your goal, or perhaps your drive, is to discover, well, where do you fit in that larger plan? Where do you fit in this larger scheme? And that's something that Winthrop will certainly try to expound upon and understand throughout this text. But one of the things that I find quite refreshing with a figure like Winthrop, which might place him in contrast to someone like Rawlinson, is how charity and how the moral law, as Winthrop understands it, is meant or designed to work. So this is on page 179, and this is near the top of the page. By the first of these laws, man, as he was enabled, so withal is commanded to love his neighbor as himself. Upon this ground stands all the precepts of the moral law, which concerns our dealing with men. To apply this to the works of mercy, this law requires two things. First, that every man afford his help to another in every want or distress. Secondly, that he performed this out of the same affection, which makes him careful of his own goods, according to that of our Savior. So you'll notice this connection that Winthrop makes to a kind of excessive charity and the treating of one's neighbor as oneself, and that connection that he makes with those ideas to this larger moral law. One must assume that one's neighbor is oneself, and one must possess no misconception that one's neighbor is one's enemy. And this all sounds and feels very generous and very inviting. Now, from here, I think I want to talk about this question and answer section that begins on page 180, because I think this is quite an interesting and revealing way of, at least for Winthrop, it's an interesting and revealing way to get to some of his big and core ideas. And we'll just start with the first question, which is, in effect, how much should someone give? And his answer is, well, the question itself is a misunderstanding of God's law, because how much implies a limit. And it seems like, according to Winthrop, there should be no limits to what one is prepared to give. For example, Winthrop answers, if the time and occasion be ordinary, he is to give out of his abundance. Let him lay aside as God hath blessed him. If the time and occasion be extraordinary, he must be ruled by them, taking this withal, that then a man cannot likely do too much, especially if he may leave himself and his family under probable means of comfortable subsistence. So, and Winthrop develops this a bit later, this idea that there should be no limits to what one is prepared to give. One should, according to Winthrop, as I'm reading it, give indiscriminately, and that is once again a radical notion that would only really work, it seems, if there was this large communal structure in place that would ensure that one wouldn't just fall into complete ruin if one gave with the kind of aggression that Winthrop wants. And I'll get to that in just a moment as well. But part of how Winthrop justifies this, again, when just thinking about this idea that everything has a place, everything is preordained, Winthrop seems to argue that God will repay this kind of charity. So this is still on page 180. For first, he that gives to the poor lend to the Lord, and he will repay him even in this life, and hundredfold to him or his. The righteousness is ever merciful, and lendeth, and his seed enjoyeth the blessing. So what's interesting here, because as I read it, what Winthrop ultimately says, or what Winthrop is in effect saying, is you should, again, give aggressively, give indiscriminately, because if you do so, God will return your acts of generosity, not just in some distant future after you're dead in a spiritual sense. Winthrop seems to argue that God will, for a lack of a better phrase, God will take care of you. God will take care of your family. And this feels a lot today, especially when you think about televangelism. This sounds quite similar to what's called the prosperity gospel. And if you're unfamiliar with it, I'm happy to provide some information. But all of televangelism is predicated on this notion that if you give to this particular religious figure, that's planting, quote, a seed, and God will then return it to you in abundance. But I think obviously the differences between a televangelist and someone like Winthrop is Winthrop seems so Winthrop has a kind of conviction, and Winthrop sees each individual person, again, as part of this larger community. They only see and understand themselves as individuals once they pass through this collective communal structure. But for a televangelist, or for televangelists, there's never that sense at all. It's about isolated individuals acting on behalf of themselves and themselves alone. And I think that's perhaps part of, or one way of distinguishing or differentiating between the sorts of things that Winthrop says in moments like this that sound like the kind of thing you might hear from a televangelist today. And the second question, which is on page 181, is perhaps more pointed when thinking about money, because the first question was really just how much should someone give in relation to what they have, right? But the second question is far more specific and pointed. How should a Christian lend money, or what should a Christian do with their money in these lending and borrowing situations? And Winthrop's answer is perhaps surprising to you. This is what he says. Thou must observe whether thy brother hath present or probable or possible means of repaying thee. If there be none of these, thou must give him according to his necessity, rather than lend him as he requires. If he hath present means of repaying thee, thou art to look at him not as an act of mercy, but by way of commerce, wherein thou art to walk by the rule of justice. But if his means of repaying thee be only probable or possible, then is he an object of thy mercy. Thou must lend to him, though there be danger of losing it. Then he quotes Deuteronomy 15:7. So again, what Winthrop says here, and as I'm reading it, he's quite clear about it. Lend, I suppose, if you must, but you should probably just give it away, right? Again, from the text, quote, thou must give him according to his necessity, end quote. So what we're seeing here with Winthrop is a kind of radical charity, thinking about not oneself as that which is primary, but thinking about those around you in your community as that which is primary. And similar to Bradford, I mentioned this earlier in this lecture, and I believe I mentioned it last week, knowing who you are as an individual, really understanding and realizing yourself as an individual. It's not something you do isolated away from a community. You only seem to get to that through really buying into and indulging in some of these communal notions. And that is, in many ways, a radical departure from how we often think about ourselves as individuals in relation to these larger communal collective projects. And today, for example, if anyone were to say, well, you should really think about the collective more than you should think about yourself as an individual, they're often maligned and ignored for their communist or socialist sympathies. But notice for Winthrop, there seems to be some striking similarities. Now, I think the religious component is, of course, important because he's thinking about this elected group. Perhaps he's not necessarily thinking about everyone as we would think of that term, but there are, again, some similarities between what we're hearing with a figure like Winthrop and with a figure like Bradford. And today, if you just think about contemporary political discourse and how people are thinking about, well, the place of these larger communal projects, and in particular, the place of the individual within these larger communal projects. So now I think let's talk about the third question, which is at the bottom of page 181. The question, what rule must we observe in forgiving? And again, Winthrop's answer, I'm not sure if it would surprise you or not, but he seems to embrace a kind of radical forgiveness. Forgive, forgive, forgive. This is what he says. You must forgive, except in cause where thou hast a surety of a lawful pledge. And then he quotes from Deuteronomy again. But the emphasis here seems to be, again, on a kind of radical forgiveness. And I think the question I would encourage you to consider is, well, why does he argue for? And why does he seem to embrace this kind of radical forgiveness? How is this potentially connected to his answers to the first two questions? And the final question on 182, What rule must we observe and walk by in cause of community of peril? Which is another way of saying, what do we do with a community in peril? And his answers, I wonder if it surprises you or not, subjugate yourself as an individual. You do not matter as much as the community. Quote, the same as before, but with more enlargement towards others and less respect towards ourselves and our own right. And again, here now at the end of these four questions, I think the question I would ask you to entertain is, well, how does this de-emphasizing of the individual, why is this important to Winthrop? How does it fit within this larger project he wants to develop? And perhaps more importantly, what do you think of it? Do you agree with him? Is this one of the moments where we can see some of Winthrop's idealism and because of that, some of the potential flaws or some of the potential problems with what he advocates? And I think now I just want to highlight what I think are some important passages, again, moments that give us a clearer picture of what Winthrop ultimately argues, again, some of the laws and characteristics that define this community that he wants to build. I think the first is just how he seems to define love. We see this on 183. This is the first full paragraph. It's about the middle of the page. The definition which the scripture gives us of love is this: love is the bond of perfection. First, it is a bond of ligament. Secondly, it makes the work perfect. There is no body but consists of parts, and that which knits these parts together gives the body its perfection because it makes each part so contiguous to others, and thereby they do mutually participate with each other, both in strength and infirmity, in pleasure and pain. To instance, in the most perfect of all bodies, Christ and his church make one body. The several parts of the body, considered apart before they were united, were as disproportionate and as much disordering as so many contrary qualities or elements. But when Christ comes and by his Spirit and love knits all these parts to himself and each to other, it is become the most perfect and best proportioned body in the world. Then he seems to quote from Ephesians, quote, Christ, by whom all the body being knit together by every joint for the furniture thereof, according to the effectual power, which is the measure of every perfection of parts, a glorious body without spot or wrinkle, the ligaments hereof being Christ or his love, for Christ is love. So this definition is right. Love is the bond of perfection. So you'll notice, and he's deploying this kind of metaphor that is often recycled, this body metaphor, and having all these disparate parts connected together in one collective whole. And for Winthrop, the thing that unites this body, it's not necessarily a set of values. It's actually love, and in particular, the love that binds Christ with his flock. It creates this sense of perfection. So again, we're seeing with Winthrop how to think about this Christian body or this Christian community, to think about what ultimately binds it together. One is at that part. One is at that point thinking really of just love, this love that's shared between community members, that's shared between God and his people, so on and so forth. But there's also this sense, this love has this effect of binding both good and the bad, prosperity and depression together. Later on the page, near the bottom, this is still 183. All the parts of this body being thus united are made so contiguous in a special relation as they must need partake of each other's strength and infirmity, joy and sorrow, well and woe. So what Winthrop gives us here, again, is this a picture of this Christian community as he understands it, personified by this image of a body. But once again, I think what you might notice is how the place of the individual is not in separation from or in a kind of antagonism towards this collective body. It's not one of those situations where you define yourself as an individual by in antagonizing this unthinking collective horde. You really only start to see and understand yourself as an individual by fully buying into this notion of the collective. And I think one of the last things I'll talk about, again, as a way of just developing and supporting this notion of the collective mattering more than perhaps the desires of any particular individual, he further extends and develops this idea by discussing the differences between public and private concerns. And once again, it should come as no surprise that the public matters more than the private for a figure like Winthrop. This is on page 186. Bottom of the page. It is by a mutual consent through a special overvaluing providence and a more than an ordinary approbation of the churches of Christ to seek out a place of cohabitation and consortment under a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical. In such cases as this, the care of the public must oversway all private respects, by which not only conscious but mere civil policy doth bind us. For it is a true rule that particular estates cannot subsist in the ruin of the public. So, and I'll talk about this idea of, again, a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical, but you can hear Winthrop again developing this idea or supporting this claim that private individual concerns and the wants and desires of the individual are quite meaningless if there isn't this strong communal collective component. He even says here at the end of that paragraph, for it is a true rule that particular estates, which is to say individualistic estates, cannot subsist in the ruin of the public. There cannot be a private, there cannot be particular or particularist or individualist thinking if the public doesn't exist. So again, it's just this sense that the only way you really understand yourself as an individual, that you really see yourself as a particular, is through the collective. And again, I'm curious to know what you think about this idea that Winthrop develops, because we have very much moved away from this notion. This is not something, when I teach this in a traditional classroom, I in particular start this lecture with a question. Do you think of yourself more as an individual, or do you think of yourself as part of a collective? And it should come as no surprise to you that almost all of my students value and prize and protect this notion of themselves as individuals. And they're almost skeptical of these kinds of words and ideas like collectives and communal. It all feels perhaps a bit too indoctrinating, or they're skeptical of this notion because they think, well, collective bodies just indoctrinate individuals and turn them into sheep, right? But for someone like Winthrop, he's perhaps challenging or encouraging us to rethink what it means to be an individual, because for him, it's not in contrast to the collective. You only really start to see and understand yourself as an individual after you go through the collective, after you really buy into a kind of collective or collectivist project. And I think the final thing I want to talk about, again, I mentioned this earlier, it's on page 188, this city upon a hill metaphor. So This is what he writes on 188. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. So I included some additional material in the content tab for this week for you to think about, because this city upon a hill metaphor is something that, especially in the United States, not just all of us as perhaps individual people, but especially our leaders and our political figures really like to talk about America as a city upon a hill. This is something that Ronald Reagan, who was president, I believe, from 80 to 88 or 81 to 89, but this is something that Reagan spoke about quite often and quite fondly, this notion of America as a city upon a hill. But what's interesting, and what I would perhaps encourage you to think about is, well, and you would perhaps need to go and do some of the additional reading that I asked you to do for this week, but how does this city upon a hill idea that Winthrop describes contrast from how we think about and talk about America as a city upon a hill today? And you could even include Ronald Reagan in the 1980s as today. That's contemporary, even though it was 40 years ago at this point, it seems. But yeah, just thinking about some of these differences, because we use this metaphor to define the parameters of American exceptionalism, but what have we jettisoned of Winthrop? And do you think, and you might actually think, that we need to just jettison the whole thing, right? Maybe part of the problem is when you start to think of yourself or your country or your group as exceptional, maybe you think we need to just jettison that whole idea that American exceptionalism is nothing more than a narrative we tell ourselves, like so many of the narratives we tell ourselves. But if you think that the idea and the notion still matters, well, what do you make of how we've taken some of these ideas that Winthrop articulates, but we've jettisoned others? That would be perhaps an interesting topic for an essay, which all of you have in front of you over the next couple of weeks. So I knew this lecture would be a bit shorter, which might be quite nice and quite comfortable considering the length of some of the lectures over the last 2 weeks. But I think that is where I want to stop. Again, an interesting text, and it is always quite refreshing to know that something like a sermon has a place in a class like this, even though we don't often think of a sermon as a text proper. Again, I think I mentioned this at the beginning. We often think of novels and short stories and plays and poetry and essays as texts, but it is quite cool to think of a sermon in the same way. So, okay, I think that's where I'll leave it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And until we speak again, this is Colin Cox for Early American Literature. I hope you all have a great day.